The United States Senate is the upper house of our legislature. It is designed to be a deliberative body. And what that fancy talk means, a deliberative body, is that senators, unlike congressmen, are supposed to work at a more slow and stately pace, which allows them the freedom to deliberate, to think, and let their minds play and wander so that they might notice unintended consequences of legislation. A congressman's life is frantic in the U.S. House because they're on a 2-year life cycle. It's like a little hummingbird, hearts beating, living so fast and so briefly. The Senate is much slower. It's intended to be that way to allow each senator to have more time to think about the meaning of what decisions they're making and the effects they're likely to have. The Senate is constituted of 100 senators, 2 from each state. This is not codified or maximized. There is not a maximum number of U.S. senators. Every state gets 2. If, for example, we were to include the Northern Marianas Islands as a new United States state, or Puerto Rico as a new United States state, they would each get 2 senators, and our Senate would tend to go from 100 members to 104 members, and our flag would get 52 stars. I was about to talk about the idea of statehood for the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. There are a lot of people who believe in it, mainly because one party would be almost guaranteed to get 2 new Senate seats, and it would reliably vote for one party. But we're talking about a microcosm, a little tiny city-state with a lot of people. My own belief on statehood for D.C. is if you don't want to have a federal district like our founders set up, fine, incorporate it into the state of Maryland, just like the Annapolis region across the river was kept part of Virginia. Don't let it become an independent state. It's basically a city in Maryland anyway. That's my own thought. If you have thoughts of your own on this, by all means, make them known in the comments. The United States Senate are elected for 6-year terms. So in a 12-year period, you're going to have 3 presidential elections. You're going to have 6 congressional elections for the House of Representatives. You'll only have 2 senatorial elections. Again, slow pace. The Senate is supposed to be a place of contemplation and deliberation as well as action. And if the action's to come, it's supposed to be well thought out and deliberate. 6-year terms. Now remember, this was a part of the Senate's job. The senators were not there to look out for the interests of the American population per se. They were there to look out for the interests of the states, and that is why, and I'll flip to item H, it used to be the state's house as opposed to the people's house, and each state government would have its representatives in the Senate. So whereas the House would debate the popular will, the Senate would debate the effects that the new policy would have on each state, and whether or not the states are in harmony with this or they want to stop it. So 6-year terms. Once elected by the state legislatures, now elected by the people. There are the same sorts of key committees in the Senate as there are in the House that mirror the structure of the federal bureaucracy, but in the case of the Senate Judiciary Committee, they choose to approve or block appointments to the federal judiciary. That includes federal court judges, like the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco, which is one of several federal circuit courts. And the Ninth Circuit was set up at a time when the West was very lowly populated, and therefore it has this massive area, including most of the western United States. The Ninth Circuit Court and all other federal circuit courts have judges that are approved of, that have to be approved of by the U.S. Senate. But the Senate Judiciary Committee also approves or blocks Supreme Court nominees. Now, at one time, it was considered normal for both parties to look at merely the judicial qualifications of a Supreme Court nominee. But since the 1980s, since 1986 in particular, the Supreme Court has become more politicized. We'll talk about this more when we do the judicial system. But as such, the Supreme Court's nomination process through the Senate has become a political Donnybrook. That's a reference to a big knockdown, drag-out street fight. So the Senate Judiciary Committee has a role that nothing in the House has because it appoints federal judges. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it gets to look at treaties. If the United States president negotiates a treaty using the State Department, our diplomats, and if that treaty is agreed to by a foreign government, it then has to go back to the United States Senate for ratification. Ratification is a fancy word for the Senate saying, yep, we agree it's a treaty, or nope, it will not happen. We are not going along with this. Constitution says the Senate gets to say so on whether or not a treaty is signed. So neither the President nor the Secretary of State nor anyone can assuredly make a treaty with a foreign power without taking into account how the Senate will react. The chief example of this is in 1919, President Wilson, at the end of World War I, has negotiated a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to establish a League of Nations and redraw the borders of Europe. And he didn't bring a single Republican with him. And the Republicans controlled the Senate. Wilson, for better or worse, in full disclosure, he's my least favorite president of all. But Wilson had a very strong arrogant streak. He genuinely believed that he was smarter than anyone else in the room because he had been a college professor. Wilson was willing to negotiate with the British, the French, the Italians, the Russians even, and the Japanese. But he wouldn't negotiate with Republicans. Instead of bringing Republicans with him who could come back and explain it to their senatorial colleagues, Wilson comes back to the country near the end of 1919 and says, look, I've got a treaty. It's going to prevent wars from happening in the future because we're going to join a giant international organization and we're going to be taking part in collective security, sort of like the world's policemen. To which the Senate went, huh? No! And voted, we're going to vote it down. Wilson, in fact, had a stroke. Well, he had a physical collapse that, in effect, was a stroke, while he was trying to go around the country getting the Senate, getting the people to pressure the Senate, getting the people to pressure the Senate to vote for the Treaty of Versailles. It was never passed, and the United States didn't join it, and that's probably a major cause of World War II, the treaty and the fact that we didn't sign it. So the Senate Foreign Relations Committee leads to the ratification of treaties, just like the Senate Judiciary Committee leads to the appointment of federal judges and Supreme Court justices. In the Senate, the majority does not rule. Oh, it's good to have leading people, but it's not without restraint, because the Senate has a rule called the filibuster. The filibuster is a right that any senator has to talk as long as they want. In doing so, they can shut the Senate down. Every senator can shut the Senate down. Now, they have to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And there is a movie from the around 1940 called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where you actually see the actor Jimmy Stewart playing this idealistic young congressman who talks and talks and talks and talks. Well, that's the way it's supposed to be. But the Congress has gotten soft and lazy over the last few decades, and the rules for filibuster aren't quite as hardcore as they used to be. But any single senator can stop the Senate in its tracks with a filibuster. It's a lot of power. Well, what it means is that the Senate is not supposed to be harsh like the House. It's not supposed to be winner take all, eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. It's supposed to be decorous. It's supposed to be congenial. And if it's not, things are going to happen. Now, there is a recent change. Around a dozen years ago, The Democrats, who at that time ran the Senate, decided that they were going to change the filibuster rules in terms of judges' appointments because they wanted to have majority rule and they wanted a lot of President Obama's appointments to be appointed to the bench, and they didn't want a bunch of Republican senators standing in their way. The Republicans said, you don't want to do this because at some point you're not going to be in the majority and you are changing a basic balance in the Senate. You're affecting the filibuster. You're making it less powerful, Buster. To which the Democrats said, we're doing it. Well, one of the reasons why we have Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, who were both appointed by President Trump, is because at that time that they were appointed, and to this day, the Republicans control the United States Senate, and the very rules that the Democrats instituted were used to prevent Democrats from setting up filibusters against judicial nominees like Gorsuch or Kavanaugh. Let's see. So I will come back next time, and we will try to talk more about the Senate and the leadership of both houses, and then probably we'll conclude for the week.